All right, so now I'm going to introduce our wonderful speaker today, Dr. Angélica Gutiérrez. She earned her bachelor's in political science and sociology with honors at UCLA, a fellow Bruin, her MPP at the University of Michigan, her PhD at the UCLA Anderson School of Management, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business. Recognized as one of the world's best 40 under 40 business professors by Poets and Quants, Dr. Gutierrez teaches leadership, negotiations, and diversity management at the undergraduate and graduate levels at Loyola Marymount University. She has presented her research on diversity and the imposter syndrome at national and regional academic conferences and for organizations in the nonprofit, public, and private sectors, including the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Hasbro, Fullscreen Studios, tech firms in Silicon Valley and Silicon Beach, Michigan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and universities around the world, luckily at UCLA too. Consistent with her commitment to reducing gender and racial pay disparities, Dr. Gutierrez also teaches employment negotiations to associations that serve minoritized groups, including National Latina Women Business Association, Reardon Programs, Adelante Mujer Latina, UCLA Black Business Student Association, UCLA Latino Alumni Association, Women in Tech, and the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. Please welcome Dr. Angélica Gutierrez.
Thank you so much, Kat, for that incredible introduction. Let's see. Okay, here we go. I am super excited. I gotta start from the very beginning. I'm super excited to be here to present to all of you on two topics that I absolutely am passionate about: imposter syndrome and negotiations. So I look forward to your participation throughout the participation. One of the things that my students would probably tell all of you is that I have a tendency of asking many questions. So I encourage you to please use the hand raising feature on Zoom so that I can identify you by name and you can participate. I also encourage you to ask questions. You can do so in the chat box, but I will address them at the very end during the question and answer segment. So just a little bit of background in terms of how I decided to start researching imposter syndrome and negotiations jointly. So I was delivering a negotiations presentation for a huge national association. And I still remember this. So I started off by asking the audience, hey, why do you think it's so important to negotiate effectively? And I was expecting the answer that I typically get, which is I want to get more money, right? But what I thought was so interesting is that there was a woman in the audience who raised her hand and she said, I want to be able to negotiate a better job offer, but I don't because I'm concerned that the employer is going to think to themselves that I'm not worth having a higher salary, right? And then there was another person in the audience that echoed that sentiment. The second person said, I want to be able to negotiate a higher salary, but I'm worried that I'm going to do poorly on the job. And I'm concerned that the employer is going to think to themselves, we should have never hired this person in the first place, and they certainly didn't deserve a higher salary than what we initially offered. And I thought these responses were interesting. And one of the things that occurred to me is that these individuals were essentially describing some of the thoughts and some of the fears and some of the worries that we often have when we're experiencing imposter syndrome. So it was at that point, that was the very first time that I realized I can't possibly talk about negotiation principles and strategies without first addressing this internal barrier that is keeping people from negotiating in the first place. So that's the motivation behind talking about imposter syndrome and how it relates to negotiations. Okay, so this is a very quick overview of what we will discuss today. So we're going to start off by talking a little bit about imposter syndrome. We'll define it. We'll talk about where these imposter feelings come from, what may be some of the triggers. We'll also talk about some of the research in this area in terms of the effects of imposterism in the professional world. And then we'll also talk about some of the strategies that I have personally implemented and that we can all use to help counter some of the debilitating effects of imposterism. So that's during the first half. During the second half, we'll get into negotiations. We're going to be talking a little bit about the compounding effect of a successful negotiation. We're also going to talk a little bit about gender differences in negotiations. And when I do these negotiations workshops, I rarely talk about gender differences because I typically have time constraints and there's only, a certain amount of content that I can cover. But it is Women's History Month, and I thought it would be very relevant to talk about women in the context of negotiations as well. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the terms and some of the principles of negotiations, and then we'll conclude with strategies on how to negotiate specifically a job offer. And at the very end, we'll have the question and answer segment. So I'm super excited to present this information today. Okay, so what exactly is imposter syndrome? It's a term that was developed by two psychotherapists, so Pauline Clance and Susan Imes. And I do want to say that those of us who research imposter syndrome don't call it a syndrome. We often refer to it as an imposter phenomenon. And the reason why we avoid using the term syndrome is because syndrome connotes some type of a medical condition, an illness, and referring to the imposter phenomenon as a syndrome can make it even more stigmatizing, right? For people to openly talk about their experience with these imposter feelings. So what exactly is, but I do recognize that in mainstream media, it's referred to as imposter syndrome. So I decided to use that term for purposes of today's presentation. So the imposter syndrome refers to feelings of inadequacy that high achieving individuals experience. So people may feel unintelligent, they may feel incompetent, and they may have this fear that other people around them are going to discover that they actually don't belong in the positions that they occupy. So they may think to themselves, I got into this university, or I got into this graduate program, or I got this award, or I got this position because I was just lucky, or because I happened to know the right people, or they simply needed a woman or a person of color in that position. So those of us, and I say those of us because I definitely still experience imposter syndrome, those of us that have these imposter syndrome experiences tend to make external attributions for our success. So where exactly do these imposter feelings come from? Well, the research suggests that it can come from an array of sources, right? One of the triggers or one of the factors that explains imposter syndrome can be parenting styles and our personal childhood experiences. So some studies find, for example, that in families where there are multiple kids, some parents are quick to label their children. They'll say, oh, this one here, this is the athletic child. This one over here, oh, this one's the artistic one. This one is the musically talented one. This child over here, this kid, this is the smart one. Well, if we happen to not be labeled the smart kid, right, we're very likely to carry this stigma of unintelligence or incompetence into adulthood. There's also research that finds that individuals who have certain personality traits are more susceptible to experiencing imposter feelings. So people who have high levels of perfectionism, lower levels of self-esteem, or higher levels of neuroticism. Studies also find that sometimes the environments that we find ourselves in can also trigger some of these imposter feelings. So some studies find, for example, that women in STEM fields are very likely to experience imposter syndrome, as well as students of color in predominantly white institutions. And the reasons why some of us may feel like imposters in these settings, in these environments, is because we may look around, and if there aren't other people who look like us, we're very likely to think to ourselves, okay, clearly, I must not belong, because if I did, there would be other people who look like me, but they're not here. So maybe I am a fraud. Maybe I don't belong in this setting either. And that's where my latest research is going. I'm primarily focused on looking at organizations and companies and examining how certain company policies and practices and interactions in the workplace can actually trigger some of these imposter feelings. Okay, so a little bit about the research on how the imposter syndrome can impact us, especially in a professional setting. So some studies find that imposter syndrome is negatively related to career striving. What that means is that individuals who experience these imposter feelings are less likely to apply for promotions, they're less likely to apply for a leadership position or any position that brings a high degree of visibility. And the reason why they tend not to apply for those types of positions is because imposters, the people who are experiencing these feelings, will be concerned about failure. They will be concerned that if they do poorly in those positions, people are somehow going to discover that they're a fraud and that they never belonged in those positions in the first place. So failure, especially when it comes to any position that has a high degree of visibility, that's something that imposters will try to avoid at all costs. We're just trying to fly under the radar. Studies also find that individuals who experience imposter syndrome also tend to report lower levels of job satisfaction. And in my own research, I have found that people who experience imposter feelings are less likely to negotiate. Okay, so what exactly can we do to help counter the effects of imposter syndrome? So these are a couple of strategies that I wrote about in an article that was published in Diversity Professional magazine. So one of the most effective ways to counter imposter feelings is to simply name it. Recognize that it is a thing. It's called imposter syndrome, right? And I thought it was interesting. There was an interview that I had heard a while ago with J.K. Rowling. So you guys, I assume everybody knows what J.K. Rowling is, the author of Harry Potter books. And she said something that I thought was really powerful in an interview. She said, fear of naming the thing that we fear only increases fear in the thing itself. So simply by naming whatever it is that we fear, we help take away some of its power. So name it, it's called imposter syndrome. Secondly, normalize it. Recognize that individuals, no matter how brilliant or how successful they are, still experience imposter syndrome. So some of these people include award-winning actor Tom Hanks, right? Chief Operating Officer at Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg. Media executive and longtime television host, Oprah Winfrey. She has talked about experiencing imposter syndrome even now. Other individuals include U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She has also talked about experiencing imposter syndrome, even though she graduated from elite universities such as Princeton and Yale. Also, attempt to understand where the imposter syndrome or where these imposter feelings are coming from. A lot of research does suggest that if we're able to identify the root of an issue, if we're able to identify where certain feelings are coming from, we'll be in a much better position to counter its effects. And lastly, embrace it. This is super important. And I'll be honest with all of you, this last step is one of the most difficult things for me. Embrace it. So learn to see the imposter syndrome as a sign of greatness. Because when you think about it, these imposter feelings normally don't surface when we're playing it safe, when we are in our comfort zone. It's not until we decide to step outside of it and start striving for something bigger and better that we begin to experience imposter syndrome. And that's actually a good thing. So as we implement some of these strategies and start naming the imposter syndrome, normalizing it, understanding it, and embracing it, we'll be in a much better position to recognize our value and actually leverage it, especially in the context of negotiations. So that was a little bit about imposter syndrome. Now I'm going to be talking about how we can actually leverage our value in negotiations. Okay, so I'm going to be discussing the art of negotiation, speaking softly while carrying a big stick. So now I'll start with the questions that my students are all too familiar with. So who made the phrase famous, speak softly while carrying a big stick? Who can tell me? Let's test your history. Oh wait, there's people jumping into the chat box. I encourage you to use the hand raising feature so that I can identify you by name. But let's see what you guys wrote. Oh, perfect. So Molly Collins, Teddy Roosevelt, exactly. So he made the phrase famous, right? It's actually a West African proverb, but he made the phrase famous, as Molly just mentioned, because he used it to describe US foreign policy, right? Theodore Roosevelt believed that as a country, we should be able to negotiate with other countries, and he believed that we should be as diplomatic as possible, right? But he also believed that, hey, if we're not able to reach the agreement that we desire, Roosevelt believed that we should be able to use our big stick, right? Which at the time was the military. Now, unfortunately, or maybe I should say fortunately, right? We can't use the military, we can't use force to get the agreements that we desire, but there are specific strategies that we can all implement, right? To strengthen our negotiation positions. So I'll start off by asking you the question that I typically ask my audiences. So why do you guys think it's so important? And I apologize for using the term you guys. I realize that it's so sexist. It's a bad habit that I've been trying to get rid of. So the first step in getting rid of a bad habit is awareness. So I reached that point, but I still use it. So what do you all think is the most important reason for negotiating effectively? Why do you think it's so important to talk about negotiations and to learn how to negotiate effectively? Let's see your hands. I'll ask Celine because Celine is one of my little squares here. Hi, Celine. So why do you think it's so important to negotiate, especially a job offer?
Well, it's funny that you asked because I'm about to apply to internships for next year.
Congratulations.
And I think it's because you really have to represent, you know, your value and your worth, and you have to be confident in the skills that you learned thus far and really just project like, you know, this is who I am, this is a worker, and this is why I want to be on your team. And this is why it's valuable for you to have me on your team.
Exactly. I love that mentality, right? So you want to negotiate because it's essentially a way to project confidence, right? And you're also, as you describe, you're also demonstrating your value. You're conveying to them why you would be the best candidate for the position. And I'm so glad that you mentioned internships because a lot of undergrads are hesitant to negotiating the pay for the internships because they often think to themselves, oh, I have very limited work experience, right? I will be happy, I will be grateful if I get any kind of internship. And no, I rarely teach undergrads nowadays. They have me teaching mostly MBA and executive MBA students, but when I do teach undergrads, I talk extensively about negotiations. And I can tell all of you that I get so happy when I get emails from my little undergrads saying that they negotiated, you know, an additional $4 or $5 in hourly wage, right? And I think that's remarkable, not just because of the monetary amount, but more so because they're developing that confidence, right, on how to negotiate. So good for you, Celine. Hopefully you'll find this presentation helpful and feel free to stay in touch going forward if you want to discuss this further. Okay, so yes, you want to demonstrate or you want to convey confidence, right? Why else do you want to negotiate effectively? Why do you think it's so important to do so? Catherine Sturm.
I was just going to say that, at least for me, it's kind of a big point of anxiety because it's one of those things that's kind of a ripple effect. You know, it's one thing, but it impacts so many parts of your life. You know, I have children. Again, like you were saying in the beginning, like just this idea that something about your job equates to your self-worth, just all of those things, you know, your ability to provide or to be happy at work. It just seems like one piece that really impacts a lot around you.
Yes, that's an excellent point, Catherine. So so you're absolutely right that negotiating specifically a job offer can be very anxiety provoking for the reasons that you mentioned, right? There's a lot riding on that negotiation. It can impact so many different parts of your life, right? Good. So one of the most popular reasons that I get in these workshops, oh look, there's people writing in the chat. Carlos said people might take advantage of you, so one may need to negotiate for a better lifestyle. That's a good point, Carlos, right? So they might be trying to lowball us. We have to negotiate. Patrick Lee said you want the best deal for yourself and for others if you represent clients such as in sports or real estate. Absolutely true, right? So you also want to protect other people's interests. Courtney said to serve as an advocate for yourself. Absolutely. I love all of these responses. Katie, to show you know your worth and value to their company. Absolutely. Similar to what Celine had mentioned, right? So the number one reason that most people give in these negotiation workshops is, I want more money. Like people just unapologetically say, I want a higher salary. That's why I want to negotiate, right? So there's a study that looked at recent MBA grads, right? And these researchers ended up comparing the salaries of recent MBA grads that either negotiated or didn't negotiate that first job offer out of grad school. And what these researchers found is that those who negotiated a job offer got a little bit over $4,000 in salary. So some of us may look at the $4,000 and say, well, you know, it doesn't seem that much, right? It's not like 10, 15, or 20. But in reality, that $4,000 has a compounding effect. So the same researchers that conducted that study ended up projecting how much more money those who negotiated that initial job offer would get over the course of a lifetime relative to the people who didn't negotiate that first job offer. So assuming that neither group ever negotiated again, and assuming that both of them are getting, you know, about a 3% pay increase every year, which is considered normative in most companies, the people who initiated that first job offer after graduating from business school ended up getting $240,000 more than the people who didn't negotiate that first offer, right? So it has a significant effect. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about gender differences in negotiations. So I'll ask you all another question, and I encourage you to raise your hand so that I can identify you. Who do you think negotiates more often, men or women? What would be your guess? You're all a little shy. I see a lot of people inputting in the chat. Wow, yes, so you're all correct. Amani, Alma, Lauren, Katie, Jillian. Notice it's all women, said men. Exactly, right? So a lot of studies do find that men tend to negotiate more often than women. And so there was a different study that was conducted. And in this study, researchers asked both men and women two very simple questions. So they asked women, hey, when was your most recent negotiation? And you can see on the y-axis, I get my x-axis and my y-axis confused. You can see the number of weeks ago, right? So they asked women, hey, when was your most recent negotiation? Women said, oh, it's been about 4 weeks ago. Men, on the other hand, said, oh, it's only been about 2 weeks ago. They then asked men and women a different question, which is, hey, when do you think you're going to negotiate again? Women said, oh, it's probably not going to be for at least another 4 weeks. Men, on the other hand, said, I'm probably going to negotiate in the next week. So there's definitely a significant difference in terms of the frequency with which men and women negotiate, right? With men negotiating a lot more often. Now let's get to the why question. Why do you think that men tend to negotiate more than women? Or a different way of phrasing the question is, why do you think that women negotiate less relative to men? I'd love to see your hands raised so that I can identify you by name. What do you guys think? What are some of the contributing factors to this disparity in terms of the frequency with which men negotiate relative to women? What do y'all think? Okay, if you're more, oh, here we go. I was gonna say, if you're more comfortable using the chat box, we'll go with chat box. Mariana.
Hi, yes. I was thinking, well, first, I think it's also subject to the amount of job offers that the difference between the offers that men and women get, and also the experience that they intrinsically have being negotiating. So it's like a cycle.
That's a very good point, Mariana. So it could be just a function of the level of comfort, right? So men may continue negotiating more than women because they may have developed a high degree of comfort over time after doing it for so often, right? Good. My chat box went away. Let's see what the rest of you have said. Okay. So Celine Trong says self-fulfilling prophecy. David said men are more likely to take risks. Yes. Catherine said greater tendency to shrug off failure. Yes. Any other reasons? So you all gave valid explanations. Anna Brungard.
Yes, thank you. I think that a lot of it might have to do with just gender bias or internalized gender difference in the workplace. So, for example, I'm thinking about perhaps a female worker not wanting to be perceived as pushy or with like unfeminine traits that might somehow then cause the perception of her in the office to shift, like she's a problem maker, she's a squeaky wheel, even though if these kind of go get 'em, take action traits were being exhibited by a male colleague, they would be praised. So I think there's a little bit of that at play as well, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's definitely a concern about being perceived a certain way, right? Because the behaviors that are associated with an effective negotiator are actually incongruent with the traits or characteristics that are often associated with being a woman, right? Good. Okay, there's a couple of others in the chat box. Charlie said they have been taught to separate business from emotion. Absolutely, Charlie, that's definitely one of the contributing factors. So here are some, and some of you have already mentioned them. So one of the reasons why men tend to negotiate more often than women is because they view negotiations very differently. So there's studies that find that men actually view a negotiation as a sport, as simply a competition, as an opportunity to win. Women, on the other hand, and this may relate a little bit to what Anna had mentioned, women tend to be a lot more relationship focused. So one of the concerns that women often have in a negotiation is that they're uncomfortable being aggressive or being assertive because they're concerned about how the other party is going to perceive them. And they're also afraid that being too assertive may tarnish their relationship with the other party. So there's definitely differences in terms of how men and women view a negotiation and what the implications of negotiating may be for them. Okay, another reason why men tend to negotiate more, and somebody said this in the chat box, there's some studies that find that one of the reasons why men negotiate more, especially job offers, is because they go into the negotiation already assuming that they're going to be lowballed. They're already thinking to themselves, you know what, this company's is probably going to give me or try to give me a salary that's lower than what I truly deserve. So they go into a negotiation already feeling like they're going to have to ask for an offer a lot higher than whatever they are initially offered. Okay. And this also relates, I think, to, was it Katie or Anna? Somebody mentioned earlier this idea of stereotypes and perceptions, right? So one of the other reasons why women tend to negotiate less than men is because negotiations are often viewed as a masculine activity. And as I mentioned earlier too, the traits and characteristics and behaviors that are associated with an effective negotiator tend to be the same behaviors, characteristics, and traits that are associated with being a man. And those traits and characteristics tend to be incongruent with the stereotypes or characteristics that are associated with women. And so studies do find that when women negotiate, they can be susceptible to backlash because negotiating is viewed as a violation of this prescriptive stereotype. Okay, so there's this study that found backlash. Oh, for some reason I have a stopwatch that just went off. Sorry about that. It must be the stopwatch that I was using when I was still teaching in person. Okay, so there's a study that did find that, hey, women who negotiate are actually susceptible to backlash. So in this study, they asked individuals to evaluate women who either negotiated a job offer versus women who didn't negotiate a job offer. And on the y-axis, you can see the results. So these evaluators were asked to rank on a scale from 0 to 6, how willing they would be to work with a woman who either negotiated her job offer or didn't negotiate a job offer. And as you can see, they were much more willing to work or collaborate with a woman who didn't negotiate. So this is a penalty, right, that women may experience when they decide to negotiate. They may be perceived negatively, and as a result, some individuals may not be as willing to work with them. So when people see that these results, they often say, oh, I want to avoid backlash, and there's no incentive for me as a woman, right, to negotiate. And my response is, no, we definitely need to negotiate, right? There's a pay disparity between men and women. And one of the big contributing factors is our unwillingness or inability to negotiate. But one of the things that I do talk about when I'm speaking specifically to women audiences about negotiations is that there's certain approaches to negotiating, there's certain ways of couching an ask that may be considered more palatable to the other party. And it always makes me sick to my stomach to say, oh, we have to focus on couching things a certain way, softening our language. And the reason why it makes me feel sick is because we shouldn't have to be so cautious about how we are presenting our requests, right? But unfortunately, if we don't, we could be susceptible to this backlash that has been very well documented. Okay, so now I'm gonna talk a little bit about negotiation principles and strategies. I'm gonna share with you some of the terms that are typically used in negotiations. And I often say that negotiating with another party for the first time, so somebody that you've never met, is similar to traveling to a foreign country for the first time. So I'm just curious, and I would love to see your chat box responses. What countries have you all traveled to? What are some of the countries that you all been to? Let's see. I know you've all traveled. Maybe not in this last year, right? Mexico, Canada. Celine said Mexico, Canada. Egamaria said Mexico, Turkey, and France. Mali, Morocco, Spain, France. Oh my goodness. Egypt, Korea. Christopher, you're in Korea now. Very cool. Sri Lanka, Mexico, Algeria, Greece, Peru, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, Iceland, Japan, Germany. Oh my goodness, you guys are all well traveled. Brazil, Italy, France, Mexico, Canada, England, Spain, France. There's very popular Austria, England, Turkey, Mexico, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Barcelona, my favorite, Iceland. Good Lord. Vietnam. You guys are impressive. I'm just wondering, like, where the hell have I been? I have not traveled to any or most of those countries. I'm looking forward to traveling more. I've been too focused on tenure. Thank God. I'm happy to report I earned tenure 2 years ago, but then we were hit with the pandemic this past year, so I haven't been able to travel. I'm really looking forward to renewing my passport and traveling a lot more. All right, so the reason why I say that negotiating with another party for the first time is similar to traveling to a foreign country for the first time is because when we go to another country, we may not know or even understand people's needs, concerns, or interests, right? We may have no idea what those things are for the people in that country. But if we're able to speak the same language, at the very least, we'll be able to communicate effectively. Similarly, in a negotiation, we may be meeting the other party for the first time. We may not know what his or her interests or concerns or needs may be, but if we're both speaking the language of negotiations, at the very least, we'll be able to communicate effectively. So these are some of the terms that are part of the language of negotiations. So there are issues, positions, and interests. So issues or an issue takes on a different meaning in the context of negotiations than the way we may typically use the word issue in our daily lives. I'm sure you have all heard people say, oh, so-and-so has issues, right? They're typically saying so-and-so has drama, so-and-so has a hang up. In the context of a negotiation, an issue or issues are the tangibles. They're the items over which you are negotiating and that typically go into a final contract or agreement. So let's go over some examples. Let's talk about issues that you may negotiate over when it comes to a job offer. What are some examples? Give me one example. Let's see. So, wow. Okay, good. So Courtney said benefits. Drew said paid time off. Salim also said paid time off. Ingrid said location. Good. Alyssa said healthcare. Good. Atul said working from home. Good. Parking space. Molly said parking space. Good. Paul said equity. Very good. Hey, Paul, I recognized you. Justin said leadership / professional development. Very good. Nadia said flexible work schedule. Courtney said office space. Goodness, you all have great examples of issues. Okay, so those are terrific examples. Let me ask you all a different question. So you can use your hand raising feature just because I want to take a quick poll. So how many of you, if you're not already, how many of you are thinking about going to graduate school in the future? How many of you are thinking about getting some type of a graduate degree? Okay, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, 6 people, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12. Curious how far this will go. Okay, so that's a good number. Okay, so 12 of you raise your hand. So if you know that you want to go to graduate school in the future, you want to get some type of a graduate degree, whether it's an MBA, an MPH, an MD, a PhD, hopefully you'll consider a PhD. What's an issue over which you can negotiate? So I'll ask Monique, since you're on my screen here. Monique Trin, if you're thinking about going to graduate school in the future, what's an issue over which you could negotiate?
Paying for graduate school or some kind of subsidy if they would be willing to compensate you that way.
Exactly, very good, right? So you can ask for a certain tuition reimbursement. There are some firms, I know some of them include the big 4 accounting firms. Some of you may be familiar with them like KPMG, EY, PwC, Deloitte. And so some companies will actually pay for your entire, let's say, MBA program. When I was at the University of Michigan at the Ross School of Business, one of my roommates was actually doing her master's of accounting, and she had just landed an offer with Deloitte. So they were willing to pay for her entire master's in accounting. And on top of that, paid for her CPA exam and a prep course for her to take that CPA exam. So these are all issues over which you can negotiate. Okay, a position is simply what one party is demanding from the other party, right? So if you are a job candidate, your position may be, I want the research analyst at KPMG. The employer's position may be, I want to hire the best candidate for this position, right? Interests in the context of negotiations refer to your needs, your concerns, the reasons why you're negotiating certain issues, certain tangibles in the first place. So let's go over some concrete examples. Give me some examples of interest. So let's say that the issue over which you're negotiating is a salary. You want a certain salary. What's an interest, a reason, concern, or need that you may have that would motivate you to negotiate a high salary? Whoa, there's 24 in the chat box. Travel costs, go blue. Student loans, you want to pay off student loans, good. You want to have enough money to pay for rent. Amani said that. Molly said supporting family, good. Katie said cost of living, good. Gladys, good. You want to pay for your children's education, very good examples. Charlie said, I have the experience, good. What are other reasons why you might want a higher salary? Competing offers, David Lee, very good. We're going to talk about a competing offer, BATNA, good. So excellent examples of interest. Now let me ask you all a different question. Why do you think it's so important to take the time during the negotiation to articulate, to express your interest to the other party? Why do you think it's so important? Not a lot of people do it. Most people stay fixated on their position, right? Or they simply state what the issue is. I want a higher salary, but not everybody takes the time to explain why. Why do you think that would be important? We have a couple of people who have raised their hands. Let's go with Aranthi, Jillian, and then Alex. Aranthi? No? Jillian? Nope, maybe they forgot to put it down, huh? Okay, Alex?
I think it's just beneficial to be honest about what your priorities are, and that also will be potentially an opportunity for you to build rapport with who your employer might be.
Oh, that's a very good point, Alex, right? So perhaps it's a good way to establish a rapport, right? Be transparent, be honest about why you want certain issues in the first place. Good. What are other reasons why it's important to take the time to express your interest? Let's see, Beatrice says, it validates your request and it informs them that you thought about it. Good. Charlie said, because people can read your mind and it creates empathy. Very good, right? So it can also be a strategy to create relatability. Drew said, expands the pie, it gives wiggle room for both parties. Good, that's definitely a possibility. Let's see. Okay, so I didn't see this come up, but one of the other reasons why it's so important to express your interest to the other party is because in doing so, you automatically give the other side the opportunity to introduce additional issues, tangibles that can satisfy your interest, and perhaps you hadn't considered them, right? So going back to the example of wanting a higher salary, if you take the time and tell them, hey, I want this high salary because I want to save enough money to pay for graduate school in the future, you then give the opportunity for the other party to respond and say, you know what? We actually have budgetary constraints, so we're not able to give you the salary that you're requesting, but guess what? If you want to save up enough money for graduate school in the future, we actually have a tuition reimbursement program that we can offer you. Another example would be, academics as professors. So some of us may want a high salary because we want to save enough money for a down payment for a house in the future, right? If we express to our university, hey, the reason why I want this high salary is because I want to be able to purchase a home in the future. The university can say, well, we're not able to give you the salary that you're requesting, but guess what? If that's your interest, we actually have a housing program for our faculty. We can actually help provide a down payment for your house, right? So it gives the other party the opportunity to be creative in terms of the issues they introduce that can also address your interest. Okay, good. All right, so let's see. Okay, so these are negotiation must-haves. So hopefully you'll all take the time to, carefully consider the issues that you want to negotiate. Take the time to identify your interests, right? The reasons why you're negotiating certain issues in the first place. But if you haven't had time to do very much of that, at the very least, you need to identify your BATNA and your reservation price, right? These are two of the most powerful tools that we have available to us in negotiating. So what's a BATNA? A BATNA stands for the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Some people refer to it as a plan B. Other people call it a backup plan. A BATNA is simply that option that's waiting for you if this negotiation ends in an impasse. And an impasse just means that the negotiation ended without an agreement or without a contract. So let me ask you, and there's a lot of psychology in negotiations, right? A lot of studies find that individuals who are able to secure a solid BATNA tend to be a lot more aggressive, tend to be a lot more assertive in a negotiation because they're already thinking to themselves, well, I have this option available if this doesn't work out. So what happens? They're a lot more likely to be assertive, a lot more aggressive, and they end up getting the agreements that they truly desire. So what do you think is the most secure, the most solid BATNA that you can secure when you're negotiating over a job offer? What do you think is the most solid BATNA you can secure? Let's see. What did you guys say? Okay, Atul said another job offer. Karthik said alternative job offer. Absolutely perfect, right? Securing another job offer. It's one of the reasons why negotiation experts highly recommend that if you are looking for a job, never fall in love with just one job, fall in love with two, right? If you are looking for a house, never fall in love with just one house, fall in love with two, right? If you are like me, looking for a husband, you don't fall in love with one person, you fall in love with two. Just kidding. So Lean's like, that doesn't work, by the way. People are like, I am not down with you having a BATNA. Okay, so that's BATNA. Then there's reservation price. Make sure that before you start negotiating, especially a job offer, make sure that you establish your reservation price. It's also referred to as your resistance point. Stephanie, you have your hand? No? Okay. Okay. So reservation price is also referred to as your resistance point. That's the formal definition that you see here on your screen. It's essentially your bottom line in the context of a job negotiation. It's the minimum salary that you're willing to accept before you walk away and let that negotiation end in an impasse. So let me ask you a quick question. How would you establish your reservation price / resistance point? How would you determine what should be the minimum salary that you're willing to accept in that negotiation? How would you determine that? Let me see. Any responses in the chat box? I can't see my chat box. Okay, so I'll rely on Henry. Oh, here we go. There's a lot of chat box here. This is fun. My students don't use a lot of chat box. They usually just raise their hand. This is great. Let's see. Precious, I was joking. You said it was good advice. I was joking about BATNA. It only applies to professional world. Celine, yes. No, you guys are, no. I'm having a negative influence on all of you. Okay, Kat, you said understand your financial needs and goals. Okay, good. Lucy, that's good, right? So Lucy said consider your budget. Vanessa Heimles said market research. Exactly. Celine also said look at the average and shoot a little higher. Absolutely perfect. Okay. So as you already mentioned, you establish your reservation price / resistance point by conducting your research, right? Determining what comparable companies are paying for the position that you just received. Notice that I said for the position that you just received, because it's important for us to know that none of us have the ability to negotiate until we have a hard offer in hand, right? So you can research what comparable companies are paying for that position. What I mean by comparable companies, these are companies that are in the same industry, same sector, same size. You have to control for all of those variables. That research will help you determine what's the minimum that you're willing to accept, right? So I'll ask you all a true or false question, and you can use your hand raising feature just so that I can take a quick poll. So true or false? In the context of a job negotiation, when the employer asks for your salary requirements, you should always disclose your reservation price. So true or false? In the context of a job negotiation, when the employer asks for your salary requirement, you should always disclose your reservation price. So quick show of hands, how many of you think that's true? Okay, so everybody's on the chat box instead. Let's see. False, false. Depends, do you have an offer in hand? Good question. False. It's false, exactly. So why is it false? let me ask Gladys. Gladys Espinosa. So you answered correctly. You said it's false. We shouldn't start off by disclosing our reservation price. Why is that false? What should you start with? Is Gladys still on here? No? Oh, maybe I should stick to this chat box. You guys are a little shy. Let's see. We can lowball ourselves. Okay, so that's a good point, right? You can lowball yourselves. Vanessa said 25% higher. Okay, you could. You don't want to show your hand, Charlie said. Oh, no worries, Gladys. It's not working. Okay, start with the highball price. Exactly. Okay, good. So you should start with what we refer to as our target point / aspiration level. So that's going to be an amount that's higher than your reservation price, right? And one of the questions that I often get is, okay, how do I establish that? Well, your target point / aspiration level is essentially your ideal salary, right? It's the amount of money that you would love to get for this position. That amount is going to be informed by your reservation price, right? So when I'm teaching undergrads, right, they tend to have limited work experience. So I typically recommend anywhere from like $10,000 to $12,000 above whatever the research suggests is a reservation price for that entry-level position, right? Now, obviously, $10,000 to $12,000 is going to be peanuts. It's not going to be very much when you're negotiating job offers at the executive level, right? So at that point, it could be significantly higher. So a couple of important points to note is that your aspiration level / target point is going to be informed by your reservation price. And it's also going to be commensurate with the position that you just offered. And I'll be honest with all of you. A big factor in negotiating your target point will depend on your comfort level. And I'll give you a very quick example of that because it's pretty recent. So one of my really good friends, she's an executive, she's a marketing executive for a major toy company. And so she had been interviewing with them and she was leaving Hasbro. So she was previously at Hasbro. And so we were talking a little bit about negotiations for this new toy company, but we couldn't really develop a counter offer because she hadn't secured the job offer at the time, but we were talking about it. The day that she got the offer from this company, she was super excited. She called me, she's like, Angélica, guess what? They ended up giving me so much more money than I was previously making at Hasbro. They gave me a lot more money than I was even thinking about. And so I was like, congratulations, I'm so proud of you. And then I asked her, what are you gonna counter? And she's like, counter? She's like, I got a lot more money than I would have wanted, right? And so we were throwing out, numbers here and there. And so I suggested, I encouraged her a certain number, but she was very honest with me. She was like, you know what, I don't really feel comfortable with that. And a lot of her reservation was coming from certain stereotypes. She wasn't comfortable asking for a certain amount because she was concerned about coming across as too demanding, as too aggressive. And so I understood that. So she ended up at least countering an amount that she was comfortable with. And what do you think happened? Celine, what do you think they said to her offer when she countered? With an amount that was still higher than what they originally offered her.
Did they accept it?
Yeah, they did. No questions asked. They didn't even try to counter any further. So she came and she's like, what? She's like, I should have probably gone higher. And I was like, well, you know what? Like, it's okay. Like, you have to, introduce your target point / aspiration level based on what you also feel comfortable with, right? Like, you can do your extensive research. The market may say this could be a reasonable counter, but if you're not comfortable with it, then, you have to take that into consideration as well. Okay. Okay.
Sorry. Also, there is a really good question in the chat that Justin said. I was wondering if you could answer.
Sure. Let me see if I can. Let me see. So let me see if I can scroll down.
Angélica, so the question is, there's actually two from Justin. The first is, Is it a turnoff for a company if you name a salary that's outside of a salary range listed in the job description, even if you feel your worth or that is what the standard is based on your research? So that's the first question. The
Okay,
second is, oh,
sorry,
okay,
Kat.
go ahead.
So the first part, is it offensive or is it inappropriate?
Yeah, like is it gonna kind of like turn them off if you list a salary that's outside of the range that they've posted for the job description?
Okay, so in response to that question, if you conduct your extensive research and your target point / aspiration level and your reservation price is informed by your research, that's what the market suggests should be the amount, you're totally justified. And I wouldn't be, and this is a woman speaking, there's like so many other issues here, but I wouldn't be too concerned about them being offended or thinking that it's inappropriate or thinking that it's presumptuous. So you mentioned, right, that you may think that you're worth a certain amount. You have every right to request it. The worst that can happen is that they'll tell you like, no, we can't do that. And they can provide justification, right? But you have every right to request it, especially if it's based on your market research and it's based on your qualifications and your skills, right? Your academic or professional credentials. Yes. What was the second question, Kat?
Oh, the second question is, are companies offering less now because we are in a pandemic and any job is better than no job? And I do want to make a note here that any questions that you post into the chat, I'm making note of and we'll address in the Q&A as well. But yeah, Angélica, if you could address that.
Yes, that is such a great question, Justin. That was Justin, right? I got to take you on the road with me. So you know what? Look, I understand that there's a lot of concerns about the implications for employment, you know, with this pandemic. Like, I totally understand how a lot of people may have reservations about negotiating, especially during this time, right? They may be concerned about, you know, job offers being rescinded. Justin alluded to this. We may simply be inclined to take it, right? Because we are in a pandemic. But I can say that based on my observations, and I've actually been consulting with people who have introduced counter offers to their, who have been introducing counter offers during this pandemic, it doesn't seem that the employers are cutting back or getting offended or withdrawing job offers simply because somebody decided to negotiate. As a matter of fact, and I actually posted on my Facebook, occasionally I'll post like emails and messages that I got from people. So I can't disclose the name of the company, but there was a Fortune 500 company. Oh, actually, he's a fellow Bruin. You guys would be very proud of him. So he was actually an undergrad at UCLA, and I had delivered a negotiation workshop that he attended. He actually like retained the information and he's been applying his skills since that workshop. And he successfully negotiated an offer last year, 2020. So he got a great offer from a Fortune 500 company. And even though he was moving here to Southern California thinking, wow, I should just have this opportunity because they're, you know, they might be hard to come by during this pandemic, he still negotiated a higher salary and they actually gave it to him. He was able to successfully do that. And he actually used another offer as leverage to get a better employment terms. So I would encourage you to do that even during this pandemic. You got to recognize that you all have value. You have the qualifications, you have the academic and the professional credentials, and that's leverage for all of you. So I wouldn't be terribly concerned. Based on, as I mentioned, based on my observations, it's not as though, you know, employers are acting any differently during this pandemic. Perhaps and I can't speak to every company, right? There might be like a decrease in the number of jobs that they're offering. Like, I don't know if that's the case. But in terms of my experience with people negotiating counter offers, I haven't seen any implications that this pandemic has had on that. Thanks for your question. Okay, Kat, thank you so much for drawing those questions to my attention. And I appreciate you mentioning that the question and answer segment is coming up. So you guys will be able to ask even more questions. Okay, so as you go on to prepare for a negotiation, and it doesn't matter what type of negotiation it is, I've been focusing primarily on negotiating a job offer just because the organizers mentioned. By the way, I didn't get a chance to thank my very good friend, Corina Salazar, for the invite. We actually went to UCLA undergrad together. And so I appreciate the invite. And Kat, thank you so much for your work. So talking to the organizers, we decided that using employment offer negotiations would be a great idea. But these questions for you to consider can apply across negotiation contexts. Whether you're negotiating over the purchase or sale of a car or a house, or unfortunately, I also get phone calls from married couples who have decided to divorce and they're getting ready to negotiate, you know, the division of assets or custody schedules and things of that nature. These are all questions that you should consider in preparing for those negotiations. So first question is to ask yourself, what is my BATNA, right? What's my best alternative to this negotiated agreement? I have one right now. How can I secure one? Because in the context of negotiations, BATNA is leverage. Also, at a minimum, establish what your reservation price is going to be, right? What's going to be the lowest salary that I'm going to be willing to accept for this position? And if we don't establish that prior to a negotiation, we run the risk of simply accepting whatever the employer extends, right? And the reality is that a company's or an employer's sole purpose is protecting their bottom line. So it's very likely that that offer that they'll extend to you will be lower than you otherwise could get, right? If you had conducted your research and determined what the market is willing to pay for that position. Also ask yourself, well, what are my underlying interests, right? What are my reasons for negotiating these issues in the first place? And as we mentioned, take the time to express those interests to the other party. Also ask yourself, well, what information should I try to get before and during the negotiation? Other questions to consider may include, well, how important is each negotiation issue to you? So some negotiation experts recommend two different things. So there's some experts that suggest that when negotiating a job offer, for example, they recommend that you bundle your issues. So you create a bundle that has a high salary, perhaps only 2 weeks vacation, and perhaps mileage reimbursement, right? If you're expecting to like travel or drive extensively. Then you create another bundle that perhaps has a lower salary with a tuition reimbursement option and perhaps a little less vacation. And then you create another bundle that has a fairly high salary, perhaps a telecommuting option, and you know, a couple, like maybe 3 weeks of vacation time. And so you create these bundles that presumably you value fairly equally, and you introduce these bundles to your employer, right? With the idea being that they'll choose one bundle over the other. Another group of negotiation experts suggests that you rank your issues in order of importance from, like, let's say, I'm making up a list, from 1 through 10, with issues number 1 and 2 being those issues that are very, very important to you. And issues that are like 8, 9, or 10 on your list are the issues that you would like to have, but you're not going to be terribly heartbroken if you don't get them. So let's go over some quick examples. What are examples of issues that would rank like number 1 or number 2 on your list? Let's see. From your chat. Let's see. What are items that would rank number 1 or number 2? Salary. Lucy's like salary. Okay, good, Lucy. So that tends to be very popular, right? So give me an example of an issue that would rank like 9 or 10 on your list. Those are issues that you think, you know what, it would be cool to have them, but I'm not going to be terribly heartbroken if they don't work out. Okay, Anna also said salary top. Vanessa, that's a very good example. So she said a parking space would rank like item number 10 or 9 or 10 on her list. Good. Okay, so let me ask you all a different question. Which issues do you think you should consider negotiating first? The issues that rank highest on your list or the issues that rank lowest on your list? What would you say? Aranthi said highest. Anna said highest. What do the rest of you think? Okay, so those are good guesses. But the recommendation is that you try to, Corey, you have your hand up?
Oh yeah, I was thinking that instead of like just starting off either at the highest or lowest, like going in between each. So like start off with something high, then like go down to like your lowest one, negotiate that, and then go back to like another high requirement so that it's not like you're demanding a lot of like really expensive things at one time.
Ah, that's a very good point. So that could be a pretty creative approach, right? That could work. What do the rest of you guys think? Okay, does anybody think, okay, Ingrid, very good. So you said the lowest on their list. Ingrid, why would you want to negotiate, or why is it recommended that you start negotiating with items that are lowest on your list?
I actually thought what they would be lowest on their list. Like maybe for me, it's not that important, the parking space, but I know that they made a big deal out of it sometimes, or I've heard about it. I would be like, hey, I would love this. And they're like, oh yeah, we can do that. Oh, and so just to see how high I can get, because it's also, you know, getting them into a habit of saying yes. And we have this.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. So it's actually the opposite strategy, but I'm so glad that you were thinking along those lines. Catherine?
I was just going to say, maybe by starting at the lowest, it kind of, because you're negotiating, if it doesn't work, then it's things that you're able to let go of easier. And it seems like you're very flexible because you really are compromising. So then as you work your way up, by the time you get to your most important items, they know that you've worked with them.
Yes, exactly what Catherine just mentioned. And that's what some cities find, that if you start off with negotiating those items that are lower on your list, if your employer, the company says, sorry, we can't really do that, you can simply say, okay, I totally understand that it's not within, your resources, or you're not able to do that. So you make concessions early on, as exactly what Catherine just mentioned. You essentially let the other party have these early wins. Because studies find that by giving these concessions, making these concessions and giving the other party these early wins, you start establishing the spirit of collaboration, right? You start coming across as somebody who's a real team player, so that toward the end, as you're negotiating the items that matter the most to you, the employer is more likely to say yes, because think about it. Nobody wants to come across like a jerk, right? And tell you no, 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 straight through. And by establishing that spirit of team player, that spirit of collaboration, your employer will also be influenced by one of the most powerful tools of persuasion, which is reciprocity, right? If you've already given them some wins, they'll want to reciprocate. Right? They'll want to respond in kind and be more likely to say yes to those things that matter the most to you. Now, I do want to say that the risk is that they'll give those things to you early on, right? And by the time you get to the issues that are highest on your list, they might not say yes, right? So with that said, be very careful, be very selective in the issues that you write on your list. Just make sure that you rank them in order of importance, and then start with the things that matter the least to you. Okay. Also ask yourself, how will you start the negotiation? And there really is no right or wrong answer. Ooh, I just looked at the time. What's important to note is that how we start a negotiation is very likely how we will end a negotiation. Okay, and it's similar to the studies on married couples, right? How they start a conversation or how they start the argument, if they start, yelling at the top of their lungs, very likely to end in the same way. So just know that the tone that you establish initially will have implications. So a couple of do's and don'ts. Kat, I'm gonna try to get through these in 5 minutes. Okay, so one of the biggest don't irrationally escalate your commitment to an initial course of action. Never feel compelled to continue negotiating with the other party when it becomes exceedingly clear that you're not going to get the agreement or the terms that you desire. And there's a very popular story in negotiations that demonstrates this idea of, or this phenomenon, irrational escalation of commitment. So there was Robert Campbell. I don't know how many of you have heard of Robert Campbell, but he used to be a very successful businessman. And he got into this huge bidding war with Macy's department stores. You guys have heard of Macy's, right? So they were getting into this bidding war over the acquisition of Federated Department Stores. Now, Federated Department Stores at the time was a parent company to Bloomingdale's. You guys have probably heard of Bloomingdale's, right? So when they started this bidding war to acquire Federated Department Stores, a lot of investment analysts at the time were saying, wow, whoever acquires Federated Department Stores is going to be making such a lucrative investment, right? Because they were worth a good amount of money. And at the time, Federated Department Stores had expansion plans throughout the United States. They were going to open tons of stores. But guess what? During this bidding war, Federated Department Stores started losing money, and their expansion plans started falling through. So let me ask you all a question. If you were either Robert Campo or Macy's Department Stores, what would you have done given that data, given that information? Would you have continued trying to outbid each other, or would you have simply walked away? What would you have done? Let's see, people in the chat. Okay, drive the price down, count my losses and walk away. So Charlie, right, you could have counted your losses and simply walked away. But instead, what did Robert Campo and Macy's Department Stores do? They continued trying to outbid each other. And just when it seemed that Macy's was going to acquire Federated Department Stores, Robert Campo came back to the negotiation table and said, look, I will let you outbid me if you promise to sell to me in Bloomingdale's. And Macy's Department Store said, no, screw you. We're going to keep Federated Department Stores and Bloomingdale's. Well, what did Robert Campo do? He outbid Macy's. Well, he won that battle, but he didn't win the war, because I think it was like a year or 2 years after, Federated Department Stores ended up going out of business, and Robert Campo had to file for bankruptcy. So it's important to know that you should never feel compelled, right, to continue a negotiation when it seems you're not going to reach the agreement that we desire. Unfortunately for Robert Campo and Macy's too, they were too fixated on the energy, the time, and resources that they had already invested. So they continued to go forward, even when it became exceedingly clear that they were better off just walking away, right? Okay, another big don't is don't assume your gain is the other party's loss. So one of the reasons why negotiations end in an impasse, why they end without an agreement or a contract, is because some individuals, some parties approach negotiations as though it's gonna be a win-lose situation. They automatically assume either I'm gonna win or the other party is gonna lose, or vice versa, right? They think it's gonna be a distributive negotiation. That's a negotiation that's essentially a zero-sum game. In reality, many negotiations have what we call integrative potential. There's an opportunity, right, to introduce as many issues as possible, as many tangibles that will satisfy not just your interests, but also address the interests of the other party. Another big don't is don't anchor your judgment upon irrelevant information. So during the in-person workshops or seminars, I typically take like a nice ring with me, and I go around the room. I lead the audience to believe that I was working in jewelry sales prior to getting my PhD at Anderson. And it's astonishing how many people actually believe that I was working in jewelry sales. I have no idea how much jewelry is worth. I've never even worked in a jewelry store. But I go around the room and I claim that the ring I'm holding has a certain value. And then I ask people how much they would be willing to give me for that ring. And it's always interesting to see that most of their offers are always very close to what I claim is the value of the ring, right? So it relates to this idea, don't anchor judgment upon irrelevant information, meaning that don't assume that the information that the other party is going to give you during a negotiation, don't assume that it's going to be accurate. They may claim to have a certain degree of expertise, but they may not, right? So the best way to protect our interests and guard ourselves is to conduct extensive research on whatever it is that we're negotiating over. A big do is to insist on using objective criteria. That's particularly important when it seems that the negotiation is going to end in an impasse, and if the other negotiator is being unreasonable. So an example of Using objective criteria would be, let's say that you're negotiating over the purchase of a vehicle, right? Introducing objective criteria could be using a Cali Blue Book and presenting it to the salesperson so that you're essentially showing the actual value of the vehicle rather than having to pay whatever price the salesperson is offering for that car. Another example of using objective criteria or introducing an objective third party could be in baseball, right? Baseball negotiations. So there are times when a baseball player and his agent are unable to reach an agreement or a contract with the baseball's owner, right? With the baseball team. What typically happens is that they may go to arbitration or mediation, which is essentially using an objective party to decide over the offers that both parties are introducing. There's always that opportunity in a negotiation. Do invent options for mutual gains. So that's similar to something that I mentioned a little bit earlier. In a negotiation, one of your objectives should be to try to be as creative as possible about the issues that you could introduce that could satisfy your interests and also the interests of the other party. And the final do, focus on interests, not on positions. So there's a popular story in negotiations about two sisters who were fighting over an orange. So one sister told the other sister, I want the orange. And the other sister said, no, I want the orange. What do you guys think they did with the orange? What do you think happened to it? Let's see, what do the people in the chat say? What do you guys think they did with the orange? It got destroyed. Fight, they threw it away. Nope. Did they split it? Cat's right. Dr. Gilara, you're right. It probably spoiled. So exactly what Kat mentioned, they simply split it in half. In reality, one sister just wanted the outside of the orange. She wanted the orange peel because she wanted to bake an orange cake. The other sister just wanted the inside of the orange because she wanted to make orange juice, right? So if both sisters had taken the time to express their interest, to explain why they wanted the orange, they would have discovered, oh shoot, we can actually have the part of the orange that we really want and we could be truly happy, right? But instead, they were fixated on their positions. They were simply wanting the orange. They simply demanded the orange, and they ended up getting only half of what they really wanted. You guys have been an incredible audience. So if you're interested in reading a little bit more on negotiations, I highly recommend these two books. Very accessible, quick reads, very practical advice. And a lot of the information that I presented today are based on the principles in Getting to Yes by Fisher and Uri, and also Negotiating Rationally by Max Bazerman and Maggie Neal. If you're interested in staying in touch, I normally welcome people to email me, but I'll be honest with you, my inbox looks like a mess right now. So I highly encourage you that if you want to stay in contact, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. There's my LinkedIn address. On that note, are there any questions? Thank you so much for your engagement, especially during the chat box. I love the chat box now. All right, let me stop sharing. Oh no, we're good. Okay. So audience questions.
All right. Yeah, so these are some of the questions that I collected through the chat throughout. So I wanted to give you an opportunity, Angélica, to look through these and answer the ones that you think share common themes or are highly relevant to what we shared today.
Yes, thank you so much for these great questions. I'm just sorry, I was a little bit distracted because I just saw Noelle Womack Henderson. Hi, Noelle. She's one of my former students. So awesome. So good to see you. Okay, so thank you so much for all of your terrific questions. So what do you do if you bring up pay during an interview before you secure a job? That is such an excellent question. So I would encourage you to try to delay answering that question as much as possible. So one response could be, you know what, I would be happy to talk more extensively about salary once we have both determined that I would be the best candidate for this position. So you try to delay answering that question. But if they end up being very, very pushy, come well prepared into the negotiation, having done your extensive research to identify what your reservation point and what your target point is going to be. I'm struggling finding specific salaries in my market research. I'm often seeing really big ranges. Let me see, I gotta move this. Any help with that? So very good question. So there is a couple of sites, including payscale.com, and then there's also glassdoor.com. So those are a couple of good leads. I would also recommend that you do a little bit of research on the actual company. So some of these companies are reviewed by current or former employers online, and some of these websites actually have information on what the pay ranges are for specific positions. So I would encourage you to go with those company websites that publish like current employee or previous employee reviews. Other options would be looking at comparable companies. There's some companies that do publish that information. They'll provide you with ranges, so that would give you a good benchmark in terms of what your target point and your reservation price should be. So those would be a couple of good options. Let's see, if salary isn't listed in job description, is it appropriate to inquire about it before interviewing, putting in effort to get that job? Yes, thank you so much for asking that. So I would highly encourage you to try to do a little bit of research on what the salary level is for that position. If you haven't received an actual job offer, I would discourage you from inquiring about the salary so early on if they haven't extended a job offer. Some employers have reservations about discussing employment terms before they've actually decided that that's going to be the best candidate for the job. So I would lean on try to conduct market research to determine what the pay may be for that position rather than asking the employer directly. And so this question didn't come up, but it's important to note. Thank you so much, Matthew. It's important to note, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that none of us are in a position to negotiate until they've extended a hard offer in hand. And so some of you, if you haven't already had this experience, I can tell you that this experience is coming, especially for those of you who are undergrads and you're nearing the end of your senior year and you've been interviewing with various employers. They'll end up calling you and they'll tell you, hey, we're calling from company X and we're excited to offer you the position of fill in the blank, right? Fill in the title at a starting salary of fill in the amount. And then that future employer will ramble off all of the benefits that they're prepared to offer you, right? One of the mistakes that people make is that they get overly excited. And the first thing that comes out of their mouth is, oh, I'm so excited about this offer. Thank you so much. When should I start? That should not be our response, right? The response should be, there's a little bit of acting involved, right? And you could develop your own script, but you sound enthusiastic, right? At the end of that phone call, you say, well, thank you so much. I'm excited about the prospects of joining your team. I would be happy to carefully review the employment terms that you've just extended. Can you please email them to me? So why do you think, oh, well, I can't really ask too many questions because we're out of time. I was going to ask you, why do you think that should be your response? But the reason why you want to get them to email you the employment terms is for two important reasons. Yes, exactly what Jocelyn just mentioned, documentation, exactly. Because when they email you the employment terms, that constitutes a hard offer in hand. Don't take a verbal offer as good as gold. It's not. You definitely, exactly what Dr. Delara said, it's non-binding, right? You have to get that hard offer in hand. One way to do that is to get that email from them. Second reason why you want them to email the employment terms is because you want to have the opportunity to carefully review the terms that they're offering and then determine if they're acceptable to you based on market standards. And you want to do that before signing that employment contract, because once you sign, you're not going to be able to renegotiate those employment terms unless you go out and secure a competing offer from a comparable company. So yes, I would say I would discourage the person from asking about salary before they receive the hard offer. So I female encountered a scenario in my previous employment where male coworkers, yes, was receiving higher salary and I was supervising him. When I addressed this issue with our supervisor, I was told that he was put in a different project budget. Will you please advise on how to have handled the situation? Wow, this is so I'm so glad that you asked this question, because one of my former students actually just contacted me about a month ago. And so I had her here at LMU as an undergrad. So she had already graduated. And so she graduated, I think a year or 2 years ago. And she told me, she's like, exactly what this person just described in their question. She said, Professor, I remember you telling us that we should negotiate, and I negotiated. And the HR representative told me that the salary was non-negotiable. And she's like, but guess what? I just found out that my counterpart, you know, that this guy that's working in the department has been out of school the same amount of time that I've been out of school, but he's actually getting, I think she said like $6,000 or $7,000 more than she was getting. And she's like, but I didn't get additional money because I was told that the salary was non-negotiable. And I said, wow. I wasn't shocked, because I've heard of very similar situations, but I helped her develop a very strongly worded letter. She ended up submitting, and they brought her salary up to par to this counterpart, because that's fair. So in terms of your question, they said that he was put in a different project budget. So if you're able, even if the project budget is different, if the person is still in your same department and you're able to show that you're completing the same responsibilities, you are entitled to equal compensation. So I would go back, if you're comfortable, to that supervisor or that person who told you, well, this person, you know, was under a different budget. And I would take an extra step this time. You did a great job in simply bringing this matter to that person's attention. They simply justified it by saying, no, they were using a different budget. You go back to them if you're comfortable and say, hey, you know what? It's my understanding that we have federal legislation that says equal pay for equal work between men and women. So federally, employers are required to give equal compensation, provided that we are performing equal responsibilities. Leave it at that. As soon as employers hear law, they're a lot more responsive. So feel free to stay in touch with me. I would be happy to follow up with you regarding the situation, but that's an option, right? It's not confrontational. You just say, hey, you know what? It's actually my understanding that federal legislation stipulates equal pay for equal work. To whoever saw this question, said this question, I know, me too, I'm sorry. Let's see. Should we negotiate over email or phone? And if it's email, sorry, I think it's because I've been talking a lot. And if it's email, how many email back and forth is appropriate during negotiation? Oh, such a great question. You guys are asking such great questions. So I would say that it's a personal decision whether to negotiate over email or in person. I would say that if you haven't had extensive experience negotiating, I would encourage you to consider email, right? For an array of reasons. And I actually have a counter offer template that I use for my students. And so we're able to essentially counter each of the employment terms, like point by point. The reason why I recommend email, so one, again, if you don't have much experience negotiating, but the other reason why it's important to also consider emailing it is because you then give the employer the opportunity to determine whether the terms that you're requesting are feasible for them or not. If you get them on the phone and you ask for a certain salary, or if you ask for certain employment terms, it's very easy for them to say, sorry, we can't do that. But in reality, they haven't had time to really research if it's feasible or not. They haven't had time to go to HR. They haven't had time to go to their department manager and see if there's a budget, right, that could meet the employment terms that you're requesting. So through email, you give them the opportunity to also carefully review your counter offer and then determine on their side what's going to be feasible or not. Did anyone take notes that they'd like to share? Great question. Or Celine will take care of that. Thank you, Celine. No, not Celine. Wait, Celine? Yes, and Kat. Okay, should we negotiate over email? Okay, how do you determine if it's better to ask for more money or for other benefits, including housing opportunities, more days off, working from home? Excellent question. So that's also a personal decision. You have to really determine what's most important to you. If it's salary, having a certain level of compensation because you know that merit pay increases are going to be based on your base salary. And you know that your next employer's salary is also going to be based on what you were previously making. If that's super important, so salary may be super important for those reasons, then I would negotiate salary. But I would also identify other issues, such as the ones that you mentioned, housing opportunities, more vacation time, telecommuting option. I would also introduce those issues if your employer says that a higher salary isn't possible given budgetary constraints. So I would go after what I really, really want. And then if they're not able to do that, then you can also consider these other issues that would also be important to you. But it all depends on what matters most to you. Like I can tell you that if you were negotiating, it can also be a function of the industry, right? And the sector. So nonprofit sectors versus public versus private sector. If I knew for a fact that you were going to negotiate, let's say an offer with the nonprofit sector, I would say it's very unlikely that they're going to have salary flexibility. So in that case, you may really think about issues that you can introduce, salary requests that you can make that would be within their means to provide. So hopefully that answered that question. Any other questions?
Thank you so much, Angélica. You know, this has been so wonderful, and we appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your wisdom and your experience with our students and alums and staff here today. We unfortunately have run out of time, so all of you, I'm so grateful that everybody is here. Please feel free to stay in touch with Dr. Angélica Gutiérrez. As she requested, please look for her on LinkedIn and connect with her that way. And yeah, everybody, let's give her a round of applause and a huge thank you for being with us today. Thank you so much.